Yeah. What's the deal with it? Is it a bigger conference that Dr. Ferry just happens to be speaking at, or does anybody know what?
The last semester we had to go listen to someone speak, and I'm like,
So is it just? It's not just a Concordia thing. It's a bigger.
could be. I don't know.
Yeah, I think well.
Last event was, but this one might be different.
All I heard is that Pastor Ferry is going to be.
Interesting. I just wonder why it's downtown Milwaukee and required. Oh, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine that would be. I mean, we would just use one of our own facilities that was just him. So who knows? But is what it is. Okay, so one announcement, I had it up on Slack this morning, and I'm sure everybody saw it. So make sure you're reading Slack on a, I don't know, continual basis. Maybe check it every 15, 20 seconds, something like that. But I posted up there, this is from Pastor Smith. We have, this is every semester for your entire 4 years here. There's a student, faculty, staff Bible study every Tuesday. I announce it in my classes. But computer science is there every single week, and we try to get a couple of tables set up with some students and things like that. But you get free lunch. I say it's God and Grub. Starts at noon to 1 on Tuesdays. Starting tomorrow, you just go to the cafeteria and sign in. So you get a free lunch, save a swipe, donate the swipe to maybe your favorite CS faculty member later on. Hint, hint. So in any case, take it down to the terrace room, and it's a pretty cool group. It's an interesting Bible study from the perspective that you're sitting in a room with probably 15 or 20, theology experts who are joining the group just like anybody else. So you get some pretty detailed academic knowledge related to the Bible as part of the study. And it's a big group, so you won't be like this one person that's sneaking in, like who's the new person, but it's worth going to. So you are all invited. Okay, so let's pick up where we left off last time. So we were kind of talking about the evolution of the Windows operating system, and kind of saw how these guys came together. So again, what we're doing here is we're trying to build a foundation of kind of the history of computer science and how that rolled into programming languages, so that from this point forward in your next, this class and the next 2 programming classes after it, we're building things on top of a strong foundation. All right, so that's where this back knowledge is kind of important. Now, if we think, so we're starting to talk about this conversation, Apple versus Microsoft. So let's get into that right now. So the early Apple computers, let's just start a slide here. Actually, I'll copy this one. So the early Apple computers were running DOS. So just like all the IBM machines, so Microsoft created their partnership. We're licensing DOS to Apple computers. And who was the CEO of Apple Computers at the beginning? Steve Jobs, that guy. We've all heard of him. All right. So in the early days, they had a partnership with Microsoft making DOS, and Apple was kind of a hardware manufacturer at the time, running DOS as their operating system. Now there's quite a bit of bad blood between these 2 companies as we come into things now, but I'm going to take us down a little bit of an interesting path here. Inside of Apple, there was kind of 2 competing teams, and this model has been kind of created at a lot of companies now, not necessarily throwing it back to being inspired by Apple, but what Apple did is inside the company, they had the Apple team, and then they had this Macintosh team. With the Macintosh team having this goal of creating, get it, Macintosh, Apple, having this goal of creating kind of the next computing experience. And Steve Jobs was very passionate about that team, and so he could focus more on that. He went out and recruited the then CEO from Pepsi to come and run Apple. And there was a famous quote associated with it. Anybody know the quote that Steve Jobs used to, or roughly the quote Steve Jobs used to hire the CEO from Apple, or CEO from Pepsi? He said, do you want to change the world, or do you want to sell sugar water the rest of your life? So he left Pepsi, came over, was the CEO of Apple. Steve Jobs was really well known inside of Apple for being somewhat of a lunatic and impossible to work for and a perfectionist and all these other things that likely made Apple what it is today. And we're going to talk about that some today. But about a year and a half or so-ish after bringing in a new CEO, what did Apple do? What happened to Steve Jobs? He got fired. How do you get fired from your own company? So publicly traded companies. So publicly traded companies are owned by the investors. They have a board. Steve Jobs is just one other person that could be replaced. He doesn't lose his Apple stock or anything. He's just no longer welcome to run the company. All right, so he was fired. Now, I'm going to just create a couple of OSs in here. So during that time, leading up to it as well, the Apple line kept running DOS. And then the Macintosh line, and this is prior to Steve Jobs being fired, was running the Mac OS. The Mac OS actually came from a company called Xerox. So Xerox copy machine place. So in the early days of personal computers, Xerox was thinking about getting into personal computers and decided, you know what, the real money's in copy machines. So maybe a little bit of a hiccup there. But they were a pioneer in the graphic user interface with the mouse and invited Apple in, kind of gave away all of the secrets, let's say, all of their stuff so that Apple can take it in. This is just about networking relationships. And Apple created their Macintosh computing line running this new graphic user interface thing. And when Apple announced that right around the exact same time, machines started shipping overseas that were running Microsoft Windows, which looked to be kind of a rip-off of it. So, you decide who stole from who. Did Apple kind of steal from Xerox, then Microsoft stole from them, and maybe it's just big rich companies doing what big rich companies do. So you can decide who to demonize, but it's kind of the big rich company way. In software development, we have plenty of these examples when some programmer creates some cool invention and Microsoft or Apple or IBM or insert company in there steals it from them. They sue said company settles with them outside of court for millions of dollars, and everybody wins. Say Microsoft steals your software that you wrote in your basement, and they give you $10 million for your trouble. Chances are you weren't going to have the marketing power or the whatever behind you to turn whatever it is you created into $10 million. So they did you a favor, and Microsoft saved a whole bunch of development time by just taking what they wanted and moving on with life. Decide whether that's right or wrong or fortunate or whatever. It's pretty clear it's not ethical, but whatever, it's how it works. So in any case, it's a little bit blurry how things actually went down between Xerox and Apple and Microsoft, but there was, I'm sure, funny business going on somewhere in there, probably quite a bit of it. And that's what really drove the the axe between Apple and Microsoft. Mortal enemies from that point forward. And we're actually going to see that when we get into our, well, we've already seen it at the beginning of our programming languages here, where right here we had our split between, when we went from a procedural language to an object-oriented language. Microsoft went C++, Apple went Objective-C because they weren't going to use the same tools Microsoft was going to use. We kind of saw that trend for a long time. So in any case, we had Mac OS, and I'm going to throw kind of the first one that is of consequence. We're going to say Mac OS 6, Mac OS 7, Mac OS 8, Mac OS 9. Extremely creative naming conventions by by Apple there. Now, back at this point in time, if you were already drinking the Apple Kool-Aid, you could find nothing wrong with Apple. Apple was better than Microsoft in every single way, and the real the real software, or the real genius was in their crappy Mac OS software. So up to this point in time, DOS was, and the windowing operating systems we talked about last time, we were probably up through right around, this realm right here, Windows 95, Windows 98, around this time. And it doesn't matter how much a Apple fan person was yelling about how great Apple was, their operating system was nowhere near as solid at the technical level as Windows was. DOS had been around longer. Microsoft didn't write DOS either. So, you pick your poisons, I suppose. But the Mac operating system, and we kind of talked about this last time. Does anybody know, actually, let's just fill in a couple of gaps here, what the major evolution in our operating systems was when we went from Windows 3.1 to Windows 95? Something we take for granted today. What did Windows 95 bring to the table? We talked a little bit about that, user interface that we take for granted today, right? The start button-based user interface. But there was another major thing Windows 95 brought to the table that we don't even think about. Yeah.
Is it like double clicking on stuff?
No, we had that with Windows 3.1. Go ahead. No, I think we had that with Windows 3.1. Even more revolutionary than that, if there could be something more revolutionary than copying and pasting. Multitasking. You couldn't run more than one application before Windows 95. If you had Notepad open and you wanted to play Minesweeper, you had to close Notepad, launch Minesweeper. For those of you who are iPhone users, you had to do the same thing for the first couple of years of iOS as well. You couldn't play Pandora at the same time as you were checking your email. You have to choose. Things we take for granted today, and we'll talk about why that is when we kind of get down that line. But, in any case, when we went from Windows 3.1 to Windows 95, we brought in multitasking, the idea of minimizing an application. And coming back to it, things we take for granted today, right? We didn't have it then. So that was a major thing. Now, we're just going to generically call this more of an operating systems class topic, but we're just going to call this multitasking relatively done right. We're over here on the Apple line of things. We had a type of multitasking called preemptive multitasking. All right, so let's just generically call this fake multitasking. So technically, you could put an application in the background, and the operating system would give it just enough system resources to keep it on hospice. And so it technically was running. But in the early days of the internet, we saw this where, if you were starting to download a relatively big file, which relatively big files back then were trivial size files today, But let's say something was going to take 2 hours to download. You would put it in the background and you'd work on, a web browser or whatever for a little bit, come back to it, and you'd see it still had 2 hours left. This download speed had dropped to 3 bits per second or something like that, something super, super slow, because it wasn't actually getting true scheduled CPU time. We have this processor in the center of our computer, and this guy's job is to fake us out. It's supposed to do a whole bunch of things really, really, really fast, so we believe that all the different applications in our computer are all getting run at the exact same time. All right, so preemptive multitasking made whatever application you were running, the one in the foreground, feel very clicky, responsive, things like that. Anything that was in the background that you weren't paying attention to was barely breathing, is the kind of the idea behind it. So let's just call that crappy multitasking. And that went on for a while, really all the way through Mac OS 9. And the beyond that, these were very buggy operating systems. The Mac operating system was really famous for, you would come back to your machine and the mouse was moving. Everything was fine, but you would look up at the clock and you would see at what point did your OS crash. It was 2:13 a.m., but it's noon the next day. So you would see at what point did the OS actually crash, but the mouse system still worked. Because the mousing environment actually lived on top of the OS. Kind of unimportant for us, but let's just call this not a real great operating system. Yet, Mac fans could see no wrong in it. Now, during this time, Steve Jobs was somewhere in the middle of this. Steve Jobs was fired from Apple. What did he do when he was fired from Apple? We had a buddy, George Lucas, Star Wars guy, who was going through a kind of a rough divorce at the time, and had a little company, probably never heard of it, called Pixar, that he sold Steve Jobs for, I don't remember the number, something like $7 million or something like that. Years later, Steve Jobs sold it to Disney for 8 point some odd billion, stayed in control of the company by being still the head of the board. Pretty good deal. But in any case, so he did that little thing. But there was a major thing that he did. It was a company he founded while he was away from Apple. Anybody know what company that was? Let's go look up. It's called Next Computers. We'll bring up a nice image of this guy. It's got to be one with Steve Jobs. There's Steve Jobs there. It's a really funky logo. Well, in any case, that's the logo. There's a better picture of Steve Jobs with the Next Computer. But, so Steve Jobs went and founded this company called Next Computers. And this was during a point in time when Apple and Microsoft were completely incompatible. Now they're just sort of incompatible. But you put a floppy disk from a Mac into a PC. It says, do you want to format this? You put a floppy disk from a PC into a Mac. It says, do you want to format this? You couldn't even move your files between these two machines. So one of the selling points of Next Computers was that, it's compatible with everything. Compatible with Unix, Windows, and Mac. Very, very expensive. A lot of universities kind of bought into it, but my guess is none of you have ever seen a Next Computer. Right? They were not popular, let's say. So, now, during this point in time, Apple almost failed as a company. When I say proprietary to you, what does that mean? What does it mean when I say Apple is proprietary? Go ahead.
They don't use their products.
Okay, so, it's their way or the highway. Right? They have their special plugs, their special everything. Is that good? Is proprietary good? That's an interesting question, isn't it? What does good mean? Proprietariness works for Apple. And when they became less proprietary, they almost failed as a company. Okay. Most of us would look at Apple's pricing and things like that and say they're too expensive. I promise you, if Apple dropped their prices to be in competition with things like HP, for example, they would lose a lot of market share. They would obviously lose money because they're charging less. But the people who are Apple product users today aren't complaining about the price. Who's complaining about the price of Apple products? The people who use the other things. I'm not buying Apple because it's too expensive. Well, if Apple was half the price, you probably still wouldn't buy Apple. You know, you're anti-Apple, you're anti-whatever their business practices are, whatever it is, all right? When Apple decided, so one of the things, you know, you hear the Apple fan people say is, oh, their stuff just works. You know, iOS, the iPhone operating system just works. Mac OS, it just works. It's really stable. Things don't crash, blah, 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 whatever it is. Well, that's not really surprising given that they're writing software for their own hardware. They control both sides of the coin, right? Think about Microsoft Windows. Windows is a piece of software written by one company that's running on a zillion different computers. Pretty shocking how well Windows runs given that as a constraint, right? So having said that, when Apple started giving into the dark side, let's say, and they started saying, oh, well, we'll let other companies make hardware that's Apple compatible. You know, this was back in the days when Apple was running a processor type called PowerPC, which was made by IBM as well as Motorola. Well, they were the providers of the chip. In any case, Apple started falling apart as a company during this point in time. Did they rehire Steve Jobs? Because, I mean, Steve Jobs, before his death, he was back in charge of Apple, right? Did they rehire him? How did Steve Jobs come back to Apple? They come crawling back to him and beg him to return? Apple acquired Next Computers. And when you acquire a company, I mean, this was all planned. Apple was failing, so I'm sure the deal was not for a whole lot of money. But when you acquire a company, you get that company's personnel with it. You could choose to lay them all off if you want, but Apple acquired Next Computers, which came with their CEO, Steve Jobs, who then Apple placed as their interim CEO, you know, CEO, the ha-ha thing. What did Steve Jobs do after he came back to Apple? What are some of the small things that he, yeah, I'm sure he surrounded himself with smart people, so it's easy to give the guy credit, right? But I'm sure there were engineers and all sorts of visionaries inside of Apple who actually created these products, but Steve Jobs brought it to us, right? Okay, what are some things that he made? iPods. They make a couple of bucks off of iPods. Yeah, a couple, right? A few. iMacs. iBooks. Maybe you haven't heard of the iBook. iBook was like the early laptops. They were actually pretty cute. They had a little handle. They were like a clamshell, multicolor thing. They had a handle on the back of it. You can carry it around. They were pretty popular. Apple kind of transitioned towards the idea of the MacBook away from those and, you know, whatever. iPhone. So basically just put I in front of a whole bunch of things and started printing cash, right? Now, in the meantime, Steve Jobs was keeping Apple afloat out of his own pocket. He was making payroll for them. Now, during this period of time, Apple did they came out with an operating system called Mac OS X. And there was debate whether OS X meant OS 10 or was the X for UNIX. All right. Now, the problem with Mac OS X, actually, here's a little funny story right before this one. When Mac OS 9 was still out, there was these commercials for the dual processor. Let's see if we can find one with the tanks. G4, it's called dual G4 Mac. Just throw tank on the end of it. No, whatever. They had these commercials with, you know, these tanks, you know, like military tanks rolling in, you know, that this is the first supercomputer, you know, that you could have in your home, and You know, 2 tanks is better than 1 tank because you had 2 processors inside of these computers for these dual processor machines, not dual core, dual processor, 2 physical separate processors. Now the funny thing is that this came out during this Mac OS 9 time period, and Mac OS 9 did not support multiple processors. So Apple's shipping this hardware, brand new hardware, 2 processors, all this stuff, with an operating system running on it that can't use one of them. There were a couple of applications like Photoshop that technically knew how to take advantage of the second processor through code somewhat, but it was really kind of a funny joke. So I mean, if you were back then looking under the hood at things, which Apple people typically didn't do. They were just saying anything that Apple comes out with is the best thing ever, yada, yada, yada. But it was kind of funny. Well, so they come up with Mac OS X. What was the problem with Mac OS X related to Mac OS 9? Anybody know what the day one, if you brought home Mac OS X, you installed it on your G4 Power Mac, what couldn't you do day one? Couldn't run all your software that you had installed yesterday. This is a Unix-based operating system. Mac OS 9 was not. Completely different architecture. You might as well have said you went out and bought a Windows machine and you expected your Apple software that you had installed yesterday to run on your Windows machine. Totally different architecture. Software architecture, and we'll talk about how those things get married to each other between the hardware architecture and the software architecture. Operating systems are a collection of API calls, a collection of system calls. So any software that's written for a particular operating system is written with those system calls in mind. So if the software you had running on Mac OS 9, even though it was still running on top of the same PowerPC processor, it was written with the Mac OS 9 operating system in mind and the system calls that it understood, not these brand new incompatible system calls that maybe did the same stuff. You know, you had a system call for writing stuff out to the screen in Mac OS 9. You had a system call for writing stuff out to the screen on Mac OS X. But they were different calls. Okay, so your software that you bought 2 years ago didn't know about these system calls for Mac OS X, so it wasn't going to run on Mac OS X. So then what's funny is day one, Mac OS X shipped with a virtual machine called the Blue Box. So you would install Mac OS X, have this brand new Unix operating system, you know, with a Mac front end on it that they called Aqua back then, that ran on your machine, and you couldn't run any of your software applications. So instead, what would you do? You would launch Mac OS 9 as an application inside of Mac OS X, taking up half your system resources, running super slow, but it would allow you to launch your software you were used to using in Mac OS 9. Until the software folks, who were the people who were making your software for Mac OS 9, finally updated it so it was compatible with OS X. Sometimes for free, sometimes it was a trip to Best Buy to go buy the updated version of it that now runs on Mac OS X. More often it was the latter. All right, so in any case, that was, don't you think that would upset a lot of people? And it did. I mean, Apple did lose users over that. But the benefit, eventually they got over that hump. And Mac OS X was a major winner. Much more stable. Didn't crash anymore. Multitasking model was a legit multitasking model. It was based on top of an operating system that had been around for a long time called OpenBSD UNIX. Now, we can say, did they go out and steal OpenBSD UNIX and then put an Apple front end on it? Now it's a great operating system. Who knows what the backstory is there. But punchline is, it's now a better operating system. And this is a big deal. Now, Apple then did something else. You know, they had just survived this incompatibility war, right? Where, you know, they switched operating systems just completely on, you know, let's just say right now, the United States bans gasoline-powered cars. And everybody has to switch to Teslas, battery, you know, electric cars. Yet we still have zillions of gas stations all over the place. And none of us have the right kind of specialized plugs at our house for charging our cars. Things would be rough for a little bit because at this point we're forced to make that transition, right? And eventually we'd be able to get things turned over and start charging our cars at home and all that stuff. But there, for the first little bit there, it's going to kind of suck. So Apple just survived that, right? Then they went and did something else that put them right back into that boat. You know what else Apple did following moving over to OS X? They made another major change. That also was a major positive in the end. I've mentioned several times today that Apple was running on top of these types of processors called PowerPC processors. If you buy a Mac computer today, what kind of processor is inside of it? Intel. You buy an HP, you buy a Acer, you buy a Mac, they're all running on the same hardware, right? So Apple made a move towards Intel. Now, just a few minutes ago, I said, well, when you have software, it compiles, it's written for with two things in mind. What hardware is it meant to run on? What operating system is it meant to run on? Those two have to marry each other. Okay, so we just went through this war where all these software developers finally re-released their software so that now it's written in terms of the system calls that Mac OS X has. All of a sudden, there's a new version of Mac OS X that is running on Intel hardware. So all that software is broken again because it now knows about the system calls of the operating system, but doesn't know how to talk to the processor. Make sense? Apple has to survive this a second time, and they did. And that's what we have today is our Apple computers, which there was some bullets to dodge there, and they lucked out. Now, how many of you are Apple users at some level? Either it's your laptop or your phone or something like that. So usually you get the half and half, right? How many of you would never touch an Apple product? Oh, we don't have any. Well, at least nobody admits that in here. I'm sure there's at least a couple. So I'm gonna when Apple acquired Next Computers, something really, really substantial happened that even today most people don't know. Apple died. The company Apple ceases to exist in its form from before. I'm going to show you some documentation. So here is if you're writing some code in either Swift, so notice this is the Swift programming language, is newest programming language that's out. If we go back to our little chart here, we haven't talked about it yet, but see how we have Swift way down here? Way, way, way newer than Java, C#, C++, Objective-C, all these things, right? So Swift is only like 4 years old or something like that now. And a string in Swift starts with something called NS. And it's based on top of objects in Swift are based on top of something called NS. What do you think NS stands for? Next step. It's Next Computers. Apple today is Next Computers with an Apple logo on it. Apple acquired them. Next Computers became the new heart of Apple. They threw an Apple logo on top of Next Computers, and now what we've been using ever since is a Unix-based offering that was invented by Steve Jobs and his people when he created Next Computers, and it's been sitting right underneath their nose ever since. So Apple died. So we talk about its survival through these things where it didn't survive. Changed out everything except its logo. All right, so this is a major, major, major history point that's often not told. How many of you have heard that before? Got 1 1/4 people. It's a significant part of the history of modern computing, not just the history of Apple. And it really turned Apple into maybe what they needed to become in order to change the world the way they did, and then create some of these, we call it battles, but maybe we can call it, competition's good, right? As end users, we win. So half of us in here are iPhone users, half of us are Android users, right? Anybody running something other than those two in their smartphones? Any Blackberries, Windows Mobile, something weird?
Windows Mobile is dead.
I think you could technically probably still get a device that has Windows Mobile on it, but it was never alive by most measures. Okay, so we all pick one of the two brands, right? Apple, so we're either iPhone or we're Android users. Which is better? The iPhone people are going to say iPhone's better. Android people are going to say the Android's better. I would probably argue whichever one has come out more recently. Same thing's true with graphics cards. Who's better, NVIDIA or ATI? Whoever probably released the most recent graphics card. There was about a 6 or 7 year stretch there where NVIDIA was basically just better. But now we're basically on a more even keel. But the idea here is that through that competition, whether it's graphics cards or mobile operating systems or whatever, the consumer wins because we have these two companies with a lot of money that keep trying to one-up each other, right? So that's a good thing. So now we have legitimate competition with Apple having a strong operating system that's worth using, that Apple never really made its way into they tried to do the Mac OS X server stuff, and I'm sure you had some places that did adopt OS X as a server operating system, but generally speaking, any company that's running servers is going to either be running some form of Microsoft server environment, or they're going to be running Linux or UNIX. They probably wouldn't be messing around necessarily with Mac OS. It's too proprietary to close down. Even though it's largely effectively a Unix operating system. So for a long time, what did Apple do? They kept coming out with updates to Mac OS X, naming them after cats, right? So we had Panther, Puma, Mountain Lion, yada, yada, yada. Finally, their last one right before they came out with, what was the first one? Mavericks was their first, was it Yosemite? I don't remember which of the two. I think it was Mavericks. But in any case, before they came out with that, Apple's gotten a little bit better at humor over the years. They had their announcement of, they started saying, we don't know what to call the next version of Mac OS X because, we're starting to run out of cat names. So they had a little funny thing about maybe Mac OS X Sea Lion. And a little beach ball was bouncing a beach. I think they should have gone with it. But they called it Mountain. They called it Mavericks, rather. And now, they're releasing versions under that, but it's still that core operating system that came from Next computers that we keep updating. And now Apple computers is based on the same hardware as Windows machines is based on top of. So all the processors are the same. You have different system calls because Mac OS X is based on Unix-based system calls, where modern Windows operating systems are based on Windows NT system calls. We could sit here and argue which one's better. I would probably say Unix is the more stable operating system, but NT is stable enough. It does just fine, but the system calls are different. All right, so that's kind of our history of Apple operating systems, which then drags us back up here to our movement. We did talk about the object-oriented phone versus the procedural phone. One's the pile of wires, one looks like a phone. That's what object-orientedness is. So when in our languages we made the jump to object-oriented languages, so from C to C++, Apple went to the Objective-C side of the coin, so they didn't have to do the same thing as Microsoft was doing, and that's kind of where the war started. All right, now the companies are as friendly as big competitors can be, let's say. Apple has a Microsoft unit inside of the company for their Microsoft version of Office and things like that, and vice versa. Apple computers are a major part of what Microsoft is producing software for now as well. Now, during that same period of time, if we just kind of throw the, just tack this on at the end, we can say iOS versus Android. So this is a short way of saying Apple versus Google, right? Apple came out with the iPhone first. Let's call that our first modern smartphone. There were some smartphones before that that were more than like a flip normal phone, but and you could check your email on them and stuff like that. But if we look at our smartphones today, we're pretty much looking at the evolution that was started by iPhone. About a year and a half later, Android came out. How many of you are Android users in here? Okay, so when you look at some of the early commercials for Android, and this is always looking back on, what do they say, hindsight's always 20/20. It's all very funny now when you look back at some of these things. So with Android, the early commercials bragged about several things. I mentioned earlier today that early iOS, which is the operating system that's running on iPhone, had no multitasking. So if you had iOS the first several years, if you wanted to run your music, you couldn't check your email. Couldn't do those two things at once. You'd have to shut down your music, check your email, relaunch your music application. By today's standards, we would call that unacceptable, right? Yeah. We're humans, we're greedy. You think you just got the fastest internet, it's not fast enough. It's never going to be good enough for us, and that's okay. All right, so Android, day one, would brag they have multitasking. Now, what would Apple, in the early days of iOS, if they were going to make fun of Android, what would they have said was one of the bad things about Android? If you were an early Android user, Apple would point to Android has really bad battery life. Like really bad. And we'll swing back to that here in a second. Something else Android had day one is they had Flash support. This is from Adobe. All right, so if you've ever gone to like Yahoo Games or something like that, we're actually moving away from it now. It's a little bit harder to find Flash stuff on the internet now, but for a long time, anytime you went to a web page that kind of had like a multimedia, almost like an application running inside the page, chances are it was something Flash-based or it was a Java applet, but pretend like those don't exist for right now. All right, but go ahead.
Well, there's more JavaScript now, types of things on web pages nowadays.
No, they're actually based on HTML5. So JavaScript's part of it, but HTML5 is what took it over, which we can probably thank Apple for because of this this conversation. Is that Android had Flash support early on. Apple said we're never going to support Flash. We support HTML5 before HTML5 was even on anybody else's radar. And it probably took a company the size and with the influence of Apple to push HTML5 into the main standard, saying, hey, this is good. It's it does the same thing that Flash does, but more modernly, and it has even more features than it had. But Flash had such a huge market share, and so many people already had so many things written for Flash that they kind of lose their what's their motivation to switch over if everything supported Flash except iOS? You can get Flash in here on Windows, on Mac, blah, blah, blah. Apple started not having Flash pre-installed, but the first thing you would do when you downloaded a web browser is you would download Flash, and now you have it installed. So Android, they would brag about having Adobe Flash support. All right, now, any of you Android users today still use Flash? Who's used Android for longer? Because now we're starting to get in that point where as my audience gets younger and younger and younger, we can no longer connect back to the earliest days of Android. How many of you have been using Android longer than 5 years? 6? Yeah, we're getting close. All right, so let's see. Yeah, I think Flash was. So if we go back many years, we'll just pretend like you're my students from, call it 12 years ago. Not 12 years ago. Call it 8 years ago. That's probably better. I would ask the question in class because then you had the the real evil war, because back then iOS was definitely better. I would ask the question: how many of you really like the like the fact that your Android device supports Flash and you can use Flash on it? And you get a couple of people, oh yeah, that's great. Google forgot to tell you they removed Flash like 2 years before that. Flash is absolutely horrific to battery life, even on your desktops. If you download Flash today and go to on your laptop that's supposed to get a 10-hour battery life or something like that, you go to some website that has a little Flash video playing, you'll get like 45 minutes of battery life. Just burns through your battery like nothing. Same thing. Android had multitasking in the early days, but Google kind of rushed Android to market. And Android is based on top of the Linux operating system, which makes sense. It's a great operating system. We're going to be using Linux in here to write our software. It's a very geeky operating system, been around for a long time, very stable, all these things. But Android, especially their multitasking model, makes one very, very, very important assumption: that your computer is plugged into a wall. So all their decisions on multitasking and how that should be implemented all take into consideration that you have an unlimited source of energy, not that you're running around with a little battery pack. Hence, Android had crap battery life in the first many years of it. They weren't using different batteries. It's not like Apple's battery technology was substantially better. Apple will talk about how we've hollowed out our laptops where there's no removable parts anymore to get 2 or 3 extra cells of battery in there, and that's all fine and good, but they're all roughly using the same battery technology. So really the problem was Android's software was based on a poor multitasking model and supported some stuff that the mobile version of Flash was never really usable. If you tried to go to a site that had Flash on it on a mobile phone, it never really worked very well. In fact, I would borderline call it unusable, so not even a perk at any level, let's say. All right, but now through that competition, Apple now has multitasking. They've invented a version of multitasking that takes into consideration that it's running off battery life. So if you're an iOS developer and you can choose what happens when your application goes into the background, and you have like 8 different things that you can potentially grab into the operating system to do. One of them's like play music. One of them's like download things. So you can choose to do very specific tasks or ask the operating system to do very specific tasks for you in the background, rather than the operating system keeping all of your stuff running full in the background, using up processing power, using up battery life, and all of those things. All right, so we're going to start off next class, and let's see, we have our last paper is due Wednesday. What's the topic on that one? Anybody look at it? I think we had, today was Python 2 versus Python 3. Last week was SQL. I think we have a third paper that's due Wednesday, but it's already up. Go and look at it, whatever it is. In any case, we're going to start with Java, get into C#, finish off with Swift, and then get into Python. All right. I will see everybody on Wednesday. Hopefully I see several of you at Bible study tomorrow. Read general chat in Slack for details.
So I'm still having trouble downloading it, and the problem now seems